Right, let's make a start then. So, welcome, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's nice to see we've got currently about 120 people on the call, so that's fantastic to see, and maybe a few others coming in a bit late. My name's Stuart King. I'm Technical Manager at the Energy Institute, responsible for our human factors work as well as our power systems work, and really it's our human factors work and particularly learning from incidents. That's the hat that I'm wearing today. So today's webinar is how do we learn from incidents. We've got three speakers from industry joining us, who I will introduce shortly. Just before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available afterwards. It will be posted onto YouTube and posted to all participants, including those who couldn't join today. All participants are muted except for the presenters. During the course of the presentations, please do post questions, but please do that in the Q&A function. So somewhere either at the top or the bottom of your screen, you should see a question or Q&A function, and there should be a chat function as well. The chat is for chat, okay, introducing yourself, but the Q&A function is for questions. We won't really be checking the chat for questions. So if you have a question, please post it there. Yep, and I think that's that. So just before we begin, I've got a couple of slides just to introduce you to who the Energy Institute is. So the Energy Institute is a professional body for the energy sector. We're all about creating a better future for that sector, particularly for our members and of course for wider society. A big focus of ours is accelerating towards a just global energy transition towards net zero. So we're a chartered professional body. King Charles is the patron of the Energy Institute. We go back well over 100 years, back to 1914. We had a different name then, but we've been around in one shape or form for a long time. We award professional membership grades to people in the energy sector, such as Chartered Engineering, Chartered Energy Manager. We have around 20,000 individual members based all over the globe. We also work with a lot of companies, so we have 200 company members, and a big portion of those, around 60 or 70, or maybe a few more than that, directly contribute towards what we call our technical innovation program. So there are three aspects to the Energy Institute. One is around attracting and developing the workforce in the energy sector. So we have training and events and things like that. Another one is around convening expertise in order to inform evidence-based decision making. So we're not a trade association, but we do try to put out scientific, neutral guidance on various different topics. And we also train, for example, civil servants in the UK on energy, so they have a better understanding of how that sector works. And then the third aspect, which is really what brings us to today's webinar, is around enabling the energy industry to be safer, more efficient, lower carbon. So we have a technical and innovation program that's funded by all of these organisations here, maybe a few others if this is slightly out of date. But around 60 or 70 companies are directly funding our technical and innovation program, and that's going towards developing good practice guidance and other resources around addressing safety, health, environment, fuel quality, and various other topics. We, on average, well, it says here we publish 30 standards and good practice guidance a year, but actually last year we published, I think it was 74. So we're quite prolific in what we do. We publish a lot of guidance in a lot of areas. Today is around, I guess, human factors is the closest that we're talking about today. That committee has around 80 resources that it's published over the last 20 years. And just briefly, because it's going to be mentioned in one of the presentations today, one of the things that the Energy Institute has, and we published this about 5 years, is we launched a website called Toolbox. Now, Toolbox is an incident, essentially a database of incident alerts. We have, well, it said over 900, but I think it's over 1,000 now, incidents on there, well over 100 videos on there, shared by industry, by our members, and by others in industry. And a lot of that guidance, a lot of those incident alerts, maybe 40% now, I think, are available in, I think it's 10 different languages. And we work with a lot of our partners like Energy Safety Canada, European Process Safety Centre, IOGP, iChemie, and Safer Together, who are based in Australia, on this. So that's a completely free. I realise I haven't got the web address up there, but it's I think it's energy.toolbox.org or something like that. Sorry, I should have put the web address up there, but if you Google it or search it on or your web browser of choice, you will find it. It's called Toolbox. Right, so we've got 3 speakers today lined up talking about learning from incidents. First, we'll have David Garner, and I'll give an introduction to David in a few minutes. David is from Cadent Gas and is talking to us about how they've moved from 2D to 3D in the way they investigate and learn from incidents. Richard Scaife from the Keele Centre will be talking about the new guidance that the Keele Centre have produced for the Energy Institute that was published just a few days ago. He's going to give a good overview of what's in that guidance and pick out some of the sort of the good practices around learning from incidents. And last but not least, Tony Gower-Jones is a Tripod Foundation board member, former Shell and various other companies. And he's going to talk a bit about the future and so what have we learnt and what do we still need to learn. So where are we going in the future? So first, David Garner will be speaking first. He brings over 20 years of experience in both IT and engineering at Cadent Gas, having held roles including head of engineering, and has contributed significantly to the development of safety and operational standards across the UK, across the UK's largest gas network. Currently Director of Safety, Health and Environment, he's responsible for employee wellbeing, ensuring strong frameworks that support Cadent's environment and resilience commitments. David, I believe I've got your slides, so I will, without further ado, over to you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Stuart, and good afternoon all. So look, as Stuart said, David Garner, Director of Safety, Health and Environment for Cadent. Perhaps a few words about who we are, just to set the scene, really. So Cadent's the largest gas distribution network in the UK. We transport, give or take, about a third of the UK's non-transport energy through our system. And our system comprises of just over 130,000 kilometres of pipe transporting natural gas. And we control that gas through, give or take, 10,000 above ground installations, so pressure reduction stations and things of that nature. And that allows us to safely and securely deliver gas to 11 million homes and businesses in our footprint. And our footprint, for those that don't know, spans from the sort of north bank of the River Thames through London up to the Lake District, and from the sort of east coast across to the Welsh borders. So we kind of pick up London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Nottingham, Leicester. So the sort of the majority of the large urban conurbations, certainly with England. So, to do that, we employ about 6,000 people. Directly employ about 6,000 people, and we have a supply chain of a further 6,000 or so folk who work diligently every day to build new infrastructure. And just to get your eye on an annual basis, we replace about 1,600 kilometres of gas main. So that's Land's End to John O'Groats and another 200 kilometres into the sea of new pipe put in the ground each and every year. And if you think about that just as a construction activity on its own, significant in its scale. So we're big and complex and a vital cog within the UK's energy system. So standing off that, when I think about my job, risk, it's about risk understanding, it's about risk management. And we've got, I guess, three broad categories of risk from a sort of health and safety point of view that I sit and think about. Process safety, we have three primary risks, not on this slide. Our process safety risks are gas supply. Yeah, we need to be supplying gas 24/7 for the safety and health of the people that we serve. Containment. Yeah, the product that we transport is inherently hazardous, so ensure it's contained within our network is a primary focal point. And gas quality, making sure the product that we deliver meets the customer's needs. It has the right energy content, it has the right chemical composition, it has the right level of odorant, it lands at the right pressure, it fits within the design parameters of people's appliances. So 3 process safety risks. We have 9 occupational safety critical risks. We have more occupational risks in this, but these are our critical occupational safety risks, so things that could lead to serious injury or fatality. And I'm not going to go through every one, but you can sort of start to get your eye into working in gaseous environments, working in and around electrical apparatus, working at height. That could be up a scaffolding, up a large building. It could be stood on a road looking down a deep hole, moving plant, driving, to name but a few. So we have an array of critical safety risks. And on there as well, you'll see 2 critical health risks as well. Occupational disease through vibration, noise, dust, and mental health. Each of these have strong control frameworks around them, key controls and an array of supporting controls. And in the process safety arena, we have 12 barriers of protection, each with a myriad of risk control built into it. Underpinning all this, we have a desire. We have an ambition to become a high reliability organisation. We're not there yet, but that's very much our ambition. We recognise we're complex. We recognise we work in a high hazard environment. We want to deliver exceptional safe performance for our customers, for the public, for our people. And fostering a culture of leadership clarity, chronic unease, and a world in which we don't make the abnormal normal is the drive and push that we're on. So we know the risks and we know the controls, but yet we still, from time to time, cause harm. And what I found, or I found through life, and I sort of found this instance, is inspiration is helpful. So if you just move me on a slide, please, Stuart. So when looking for inspiration in this area, I look to this gentleman. Now, if I was sort of stood live, I'd be sort of saying, show of hands, who recognises this gentleman? Won't quite work this afternoon. The gentleman you're looking at is called Sid Watkins, Professor Sid Watkins, a neurosurgeon by trade, a scientist. He was also the medical director for Formula One. In 1994, May 1994, the San Marino Grand Prix, 2 things happened. During practice, Roland Ratzenberger crashed and was tragically killed. And then, unimaginably, on race day, Ayrton Senna, arguably the greatest racing driver of all time, crashed and was killed. He died in Sid's arms, so Sid Watkins, as part of his job, attended site to provide medical support to Ayrton. But he died. He was unable to save him. He said after the event that he felt his spirit leave his body. Now, throughout his career, using science and his tenacious drive for safety improvement, he worked tirelessly to improve the safety record within Formula One. That intensified after those tragic days in 1994. And the way in which he went about it was to look to learn. So, as I said, a man of science, he looked to understand incidents, the anatomy of the incidents, and what could be improved. And he drove changes in track design, car design, PPE, helmets, suits, and medical facilities. He was instrumental in taking a sport where you have pretty much today anyway, young men driving at 200 miles an hour around a circuit And that was, if you go back before 1994, that led to, on average, one of them being killed every year, to a world now where there has been one fatality in 25 years. And his leadership has been instrumental in driving that. So what does that tell you? What does it tell me? Simply this, that it can be done. By learning and by improving, you can shift what is inherently hazardous, arguably in Formula One, inherently dangerous. You can move from a world where you're killing someone on a frequent basis to where you've almost nearly eliminated that potential. So if you move me on, Stuart, where did that take us? So it can be done. So look, I talked a moment ago about the work we've done. So we understand our process safety risks, we understand our occupational safety risks, we understand our health risks. We have done a lot of work behind the scenes around those risks, to understand them, to analyse them, to draw them, to understand the anatomy of the risks. We had detailed bow ties built for all and catalogues of controls. What we weren't doing, though, was learning. We weren't learning from things that went wrong. And that's what drove us towards Tripod. We had built the nuts and bolts, and we had built the infrastructure where something like Tripod could deliver real value. And we shifted to it. Before that, if something happened, we kind of asked two questions, really. Well, what's happened and who did it? And you can wring that towel all day long and you won't get much out of it that will help you improve the situation for the future, which Tony will come on and talk about. The move to Tripod, though, did change that. And it took us from a world where we were looking at things either two-dimensionally or one-dimensionally to one where we were looking at it through a range of optics. We were laying out the risk. We were understanding how things were designed and how things were expected to operate. And then we'd look at what did work, what didn't work, what controls hadn't worked, which had failed. Why did they fail? What factors were in play? How were people's performances being influenced? Yeah, we were digging into and understanding what was leading to the failure. So we weren't interested just in what had happened, who did it, what had broken. We wanted to understand who. That insight and learning we have applied across an array of events and incidents. We have applied this to situations where we have had gas supply failure. Some asset has failed, it's either been damaged or has failed and has led to us being unable to provide gas to people. We've applied it to containment failures. We've applied it to gas quality issues. We've applied it around incidents involving moving plants, driving, cable damage, gas ignitions. We've applied it across a range of things, and putting in those, that scientific approach and digging into, well, why did it happen? What was going on? What factors were in play? What was impeding someone's performance? Has driven us to change. It's helped us change some behaviours, but it's also taken us back. We have changed PPE. We've intervened on assets. We've changed assets. We've changed MIT systems. We've looked at data and changed some data in the organisations. We've changed vehicles. We've changed the design of vehicles. We've changed tooling and the design of tooling. It has led to some root and branch changes in how we operate our network. Since the shift, and perhaps we've folk on the call that think it's a crude measure, and I'm sort of somewhat inclined to agree, but since we've put Tripod in, we've seen our lost time injury frequency rate move from about 0.5 a year, so that's over 1 million hours worked, to 0.15. A shift, a big shift, driven off insight and learning that has driven and enabled us to change our world to that which is a safer place. So you've just moved me on one, Stuart. kind of, I suppose, towards the final thoughts on this. So learning is really only any use if you do something with it. A book is only any value if you take it out of the library. If you leave this stuff on the shelves gathering dust, it doesn't really do anything for anyone. So engagement around this is key. So having that Sid Watkins approach to really understanding what's gone on and what's led to it and why it occurred and how it can be improved and what you can change is really useful. But it only delivers value if you engage the organisation in it and around it. So it's as important, I have found, to get your engagement right as it is to get the right tooling and the right mindset in. And we have worked hard over the last 12 to 18 months to bring the organisation with us, to talk openly in and amongst ourselves, with our board, with our people, about things that have happened and why they've happened and what we can learn, and really importantly, what we are going to do and what we're going to do collectively about it. And I can't emphasize this point strongly enough. Without this, as I say, you have books full of valuable knowledge gathering dust on a shelf. And this just gives you a flavour. We've developed dedicated channels around this stuff. We have monthly podcasts around things that happened and how people can learn and how people can interact with it. And that then runs through down to more local things where we push and drive the learning through toolbox talks and local engagement. All of that has been instrumental in us moving the dial, not only on lost time injury frequency rate, but across an array of safety measures. So look, hopefully that gives folk a bit of an insight, a bit of a glimpse into our world and the drivers and what we're pushing for in our world. And where we're trying to get to is simply this: a world in Cadent where there's zero harm, zero disruption, and we're creating an environment where people can thrive. With that, I'll say thank you and pass back to you, Stuart.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. Very inspirational, and a great start. Nice to see, an example of what industry is doing, what you're doing at Cadent. Just a reminder for people, if you have questions for David, we will be having a Q&A session at the end. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box. Excellent. Thank you very much, David. Right. So without wasting too much time, our second speaker is Richard Scaife, who has 35 years in human factors ergonomics and human error and incident investigation, and delivering training and consultancy. So Richard is director at the Kiel Centre, a well-known human factors consultancy. He's also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, chartered ergonomist, human factors specialist, and he's going to be talking about the new guidance that he and his team have written for the Energy Institute, which was published a few days ago. So, Richard, I think you're going to share your slides for this one, I believe. So let me stop sharing mine. Oh, sorry, stop share. There we go.
Okay, let me just get the technology to work and then I'll start talking properly. So thank you very much, Stuart, and welcome everybody. Thanks for having me along. Hopefully I'm sharing. Yes, talking through this guidance that we've been working with the Energy Institute to develop. It's actually taken us a little while. I mean, I think we've spent about a year on this so far. So no, really glad that we've got it all together and it's now published and it's available via the Energy Institute website. I'm not going to say too much about myself because Stuart's done such a fantastic job of it. The only thing I'm going to say about this slide is it says at the top 35 plus years experience. You might think that that photograph on the left-hand side was possibly taken around about the start of that experience. Not sure, just saying. But Stuart's covered most of that for me, so I'll not spend too much time on that. For those of you who have not come across the Kiel Centre before, so we are a firm of chartered psychologists and ergonomists based in Edinburgh, Scotland. And we also have a team based in Australia, so based out of Perth in Western Australia, but then spreading across the whole country. And the Australian team were actually quite instrumental in helping us to develop this guidance. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through this. I manage the part of the business which is human factors and ergonomics on the left-hand side of this screen. And that covers all sorts of things, including a lot of work that we do on human factors in incident investigation, which is why we wanted to get involved in the project with EI. We also have a team of my colleagues who look after business psychology and well-being. So that's more about selecting personnel for the right roles within business, chief executives, chief operating officers, and also government appointments as well. And on the third part of our business is what people often think about when you mention psychology is counselling and clinical psychology. In other words, seeing people on a one-to-one basis. So myself and my team, we deal with organisations, but the counselling clinical psychologists in our business, they deal with people who have either been referred by their occupational health department because they have psychological well-being issues at work, or they come referred by their general practitioner or doctor because they personally want to get some assistance. So that is the Keele Centre. The part of the Keele Centre that's been working with the Energy Institute on this particular project is the team of us who look after human factors and ergonomics. So prior to the latest publication, there was a previous publication, Learning from Incidents, Accidents and Events, first edition published in 2016. And what's happening to my share? There we go. Apologies, that was my technology mind. I don't think it affected you. But since that was published, I think one of the reasons why it was decided we need to revamp this, we need to have a new edition of this type of guidance, was that best practice had just moved on since 2016. I mean, we are now 10 years. So regulators had suggested that we need to be more rigorous in terms of looking at underlying factors, clearly prioritize incidents and near misses, better integration of human and organizational factors into investigations, and probably more systematically as well. Better sharing and analysis of lessons and themes coming out of investigations, systematic application of follow-up actions, shift towards more of a learning culture, and tracking trends in incident recurrence causes, etc., to try to become more informed on this. So a number of things that we're asking for were suggested, needed to be amended from the 2016 guide. And so Stuart and his team spoke to the Keele Centre about helping to develop that. Our approach to development was very much, well, let's speak to industry. Let's find out what people out in industry who have to do investigations, what do they need to know? What do they want to know? And also, what do they do well at the moment? So we didn't want to end up writing a guide which said, oh, here's some guidance on things that everyone turns around and says, well, yes, we knew that. We already do that. We've been doing it for years. So we decided that we'd start with focus groups with a number of organizations. Now, on the slide here, it says 21 focus groups and over 50 global organizations. It did grow rather rapidly once we started actually running focus groups. So my plan had been to run a very small number of focus groups, sample from different organizations, and then move into developing the actual guidance. But once the word got out that this was being written, we were kind of inundated with people saying, oh, I'd like to get involved in that. And actually, because of my colleagues out in Australia, we opened it up to the kind of Australian market, New Zealand, out to the Far East as well. So lots of organizations pretty much globally got involved in all this. So initially I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is just going to slow down producing the guidance. However, what it did produce was some really good insights into what seems to be working well across organizations at the moment and across the world. And also, where does this guidance need to focus? And as you'll see from the slide, a really wide range of industry sectors got involved. That led us to then go and do some research. So what were the areas that people felt they needed the most guidance on? And we developed the guidance based upon that research. So what is the state of the art looking like at the moment? And what do we then need to produce to help provide some help to that? Once we did actually complete the guide, and I'll not scare you too much with how many pages right now. I'll do that at the end, right? So it's a pretty comprehensive guide. But once we had actually finally finished writing all of this material, we then had that peer reviewed by industry stakeholders, so people that we had initially contacted in focus groups, but also the Energy Institute's Learning from Incidents Committee as well was able to provide a really good, solid peer review of the final product, and that included people who spent pretty much all their life doing incident investigations. They were specialists in incident investigation. As we've already said, the team that pulled this together, they were led by myself and my colleagues. We also pulled in a number of our associates consultants, some of whom have worked in organisations such as the Air Accident Investigation Branch, the Australian Transportation Safety Bureau, and other organisations around the world who specialise specifically in conducting investigations. So we were pulling together, as well as the guys from the LFI-COM, as well as the Learning from Incidents Committee, people who had in excess of 150 years combined experience of actually investigating incidents. So really good mix as well of people who specialise, people who are human factors specialists, people who develop training in this area for organisations globally, and people who are specialists in incident investigation systems, techniques, methods. So it was a really, really strong and wide-ranging team that got involved in this. Just a little bit of an overview. Now, this comes from the focus group process that we went through right at the very start. So one of the things that we wanted to do during that series of focus groups was to work out, well, what is a good representation of a typical investigation life cycle? And through consultation with all of these people from the 21 focus groups, what we learned was, well, it runs from everything from getting notified about the fact that there is something that needs to be investigated, all the way through to at the end of the investigation, so doing the actual, what people would normally think about as investigating, so terms of reference, putting the team together, collecting the data, performing the analysis, and then out of the other side of that, looking at understanding what's come out of the investigation, plan the actions, and then learning from it. So not just learning from the investigation itself, but also learning from the overall investigation process. So through review, posts, incident investigation, how did that investigation go? But also, what's that telling us about how well our investigation system's working within this business at the moment? What do we need to improve? So that whole life cycle process came from the focus groups, people that we spoke to find out what should that look like typically for an organisation. And you'll see on the right-hand side, training is pretty much plugging in to every aspect of that life cycle. And so you'll see that it's broken down the outside into 5 broad categories. So reporting, investigating, understanding, action planning, and learning. And that's then broken down into the 4 chapters within the guide. So I'll briefly take you through. I don't want to stop any of you guys from actually reading this book. So I'm not actually going to go and tell you everything that's in it, but I will give you a quick overview of the different sections. So the introduction is really just kind of introducing some of the key concepts. So hazard is inherent. Barrier failures are often linked in some way to human actions at some level. So human factors, human failures of some description are often in there somewhere. Whether it's an immediate human failure or more of a latent human failure, it's going to be in there at some point. So we need to get some focus on that. And so the introduction is just about the barrier model and the fact that we've got various aspects of human performance that could be contributing to failures in those barriers. Second stage in the process is the notification. In the document is the notification stage, which is where you get into the life cycle now of the incident. So we're talking here about a number of different aspects, including the culture within the organization and the reporting culture, but also things like psychological safety. So is the system clear, accessible, and easy to use for people? Do people understand what they need to report and when? But then what's the culture like? So is there psychological safety within the company so people feel I can speak up, it's okay to speak up and report these things? Is there a just culture? Are people encouraged to actually speak up as part of the process? And when they do speak up, do they get fed back to? So once all this has been completed, are they hearing what's come of their involvement within raising that incident? And then, of course, using KPIs to monitor the evaluation of the process at the end of the day as well. And KPIs will come up several times throughout the guide for different purposes. Triage or prioritization. So triage tends to be a little bit of a medical term, but it's basically about looking at the event that's been notified and then working out how it is we're going to deal with that event. So it's about the fact that not every single event is going to get investigated or investigated to the same level of depth. And often the sort of things that we would use to do that triage process would include what were the actual consequences, but also what were the potential consequences of that event in terms of how deep are we going to go. Likelihoods and potential learning opportunities as well. And there are a number of different tools that we include in the guidance around ways in which you can systematically apply some sort of process to that triage and prioritization. So it's not just an off-the-cuff activity. Terms of reference, the fourth section in there, almost the license to operate for your investigation. And we found some interesting things from the focus groups on this, and also from discussions with people in different organizations. And there were some organizations that did a fantastic job of developing terms of reference for their investigations. Others almost had nothing. So it was an important issue to address. So the permission to investigate, the license to investigate. And also what question you're actually asking during the investigation. So what are you actually trying to get to the bottom of? And that led to a really interesting case study that we discussed as part of the guidance. We try to do this a lot. We tried to identify some useful case studies that would actually illustrate some of the key points that we were talking about. But this was a real example of a fatality within an operating theatre from septicemia following an operation. And initially, the investigation focus was, why did the patient die? The implication of that within the theatre team was, well, that implies there's some sort of blame attributed to the surgeons. And then they changed the question. They changed the question they were trying to answer. So the question became, why was there bacteria in the operating theatre, which is focused on a system issue and not on the operational side. So terms of reference includes what is the question you're actually trying to answer here, and making sure that that is going to help you to get to a decent conclusion. As I mentioned, training comes in throughout the guide. It kind of links into pretty much all of the chapters. We have a separate chapter on it, though, which was written by one of my colleagues who has been performing investigation training for more years than I want to count, because it will make me feel very old. But the thing was, it was trying to differentiate between the training needs of people who may be full-time investigators. So their only job in the world is to perform incident investigations. They are specialists. That's all they do. And I'm talking there about people who might work for organizations such as air accident investigations, marine accident investigations, etc., etc. That is their job. But then for most organizations, particularly in chemical and process industries, our investigators are part-time. We don't investigate every single day of the week. What happens is we are provided with some training, and when we are required to perform investigation, we will have to get up to speed, and we will then perform that investigation to the best of our ability. So one of the things we actually looked at here, a couple of my colleagues are ex-military, and I've worked in the military before as well. And we used to have a thing in the military called surge training, which is you train people up to a certain level, a basic level. And then when you need to deploy them, you will look at, well, how do we get them up to operational capability really, really quickly? So we included an aspect of that within the training section of the guide. How do you take somebody who's had all the right training, but possibly hasn't practiced that training for a year, 2 years perhaps, and we need to bring them back up to speed? So that was an interesting addition to that training section, but it is pretty comprehensive. Mentioned team selection and deployment already. So normally we're looking at a team here, looking at an investigation team. We looked at the differences in diverse perspectives and actually some of the benefits of having different backgrounds in the investigation team. Can challenge each other, can be independent from the incident's original management, etc. And we also looked, very importantly for us, so as chartered psychologists and my team that I mentioned at the beginning, who are clinical psychologists, counselling psychologists, we took some advice from them about dealing with trauma during investigations. So there's two aspects to this in investigations. One is you may be speaking to somebody who is traumatized, and it's how do you deal with that situation? And we talked about the fact that often when people actually get involved in interviewing somebody, for example, who has had a traumatic experience, they're very concerned they're going to make them worse. And typically with trauma, people do recover from trauma. So part of the guidance we were providing there was how to deal with not making somebody worse, but also having the understanding about how you can help someone to get better. And that includes the investigation team themselves. So we also talked about secondary traumatic stress, or sometimes called vicarious trauma as well, whereby interviewing multiple people who are telling you about traumatic events, you become traumatized. And so we included some guidance on how to deal with that aspect as well. Then we start getting into data collection. In the next chapter, we're looking at things like preservation of the scene. We're talking about gathering witness statements initially, but then getting into interviewing. So looking at techniques like cognitive interviewing and the PEACE methodology. Raising awareness of bias and how that might influence data collection. And just giving a bit of guidance and a series of checklists for the kinds of data that could be gathered during the investigation process. Our chapter analysis did not get into becoming an all-encompassing guide to every single data analysis technique that was out there. But we did reference where to find further information on these. We were just conscious that if we produced something that was trying to tell people how to do all of these different types of models, it wouldn't have been 200 pages, it would have been more like 1,000. So we had to reference out to these, but we have given some background on the different types of model and then some specific references out to particular techniques. Developing the recommendations, we tried to keep this very practical as well. So what were the sorts of things that needed to be done in order to make those recommendations, and testing how likely those recommendations are to be disruptive of the incident sequence. Prioritization, and also making sure that we're getting the right people involved, the right stakeholders involved in producing those recommendations. Now, we split recommendations off from the investigation report because typically the investigation, the recommendations part, developing the recommendations, feeds into the report. You don't just come up with recommendations when it's report writing time. But we did provide some practical guidance to writing an investigation report, some kind of common sense stuff, but also some how to do the communication and the feedback, as well as producing the report itself. And also some legal and confidentiality considerations for the investigation report. Throughout every single chapter, we have an example here under the action tracking and closeout chapter, but we produced a checklist. We produced the common pitfalls, things you should avoid doing, and also good practices. But in terms of the action tracking side of things, we were looking at how do you word the actions, how do you track them, how do you monitor progress, and how do you check that the actions that you produced and implemented have actually been effective. Embedding the learning was the next chapter, and this is looking at individual and organizational learning. So quite narrow learning opportunities, but broadening out into much broader learning within the organization. And then beyond the organization, potentially we get into broader lesson sharing later on. And that's where the toolbox that Stuart shared at the beginning really comes in. Toolbox is an excellent example of how that sharing learning more broadly is being facilitated within industry in general. Other toolboxes are available, but I think this one's blinking good. So just about trying to get those lessons out to other people that may benefit. And the final chapter was about evaluation. So this was in looking at the investigation that's just happened. So how did that investigation go? You might get a tick in the box for that. You might also look at things that will provide you with some other sources of data for that, such as statistical analyses, etc. But then you're also trying to look at the overall investigation process as well. You're trying to think, well, this investigation was one example of an application of the investigation process within a business. So let's evaluate that overall process. Is this investigation telling us there are certain things that we need to improve within our process? And then we can try and fix that. But again, KPIs come back in very strongly at this stage because we're looking at different ways of addressing things like actions, investigation completion times, investigator training quality, etc. And we're trying to make sure that those KPIs are sensible and they're not actually leading us down the wrong sort of route or setting the wrong kind of example in terms of what we should be measuring. So that was chapter 14. And that was the final chapter. So that's the end of the life cycle at that point. And just to conclude before I hand back to Stuart, it says here, available Q1. It's available now. It came out on Wednesday, I think it was, Stuart, a couple of days back anyway, literally just a couple of days ago. It is big, but it's not intended to be read cover to cover. So you've seen how it's broken down into the different stages of the investigation life cycle. And the idea is that, you come into this having to do an investigation. You're perhaps familiar with most of those stages, but there's a couple that you've got a bit rusty on. The idea is there are checklists and there is detailed guidance in each one of those chapters to help you on that particular aspect of the investigation. There may be some people out there who do need or do want to read that entire couple of hundred pages. So people are welcome to do that. But the idea is it's divided up such that it can be utilized in the separate sections. It doesn't need to be treated as one guide. And it supersedes the 2016 guidance. And I don't know if Stuart's already mentioned this, but the price is £0, €0, and $0, and zero whatever currency you want to apply because it costs nothing. Just get yourself onto the EI website and search for EI 3295, and you will there be able to download it. So I should like to thank you all for your attention. And at this stage, I will stop sharing and hand back to Stuart.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Richard. So questions for Richard. We'll be having a Q&A in about 15 minutes after Tony's finished his presentations. So any questions you have for Richard, please put those in the Q&A. I've seen there's a few in there already. So without further ado, I'm going to just introduce Tony, and then Tony, you're going to share your slides. So excuse me. So Tony is a retired HSE director, extensive experience across high hazard engineering sectors. I believe we might have done the first HAZOP show, or one of them at least. So that gives you an idea of Tony's experience. 25 years at Shell, roles since then at Network Rail, Centrica, Chemring. Tony is a board member for the Tripod Foundation, and specialises in delivering behavioural change that improves safety culture, and has directed multi-billion pound projects internationally across the various different sectors. So, Tony, very pleased to have you here, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Can I just check if I'm sharing? My colleagues should be able to see. Great. And the mic works. Gosh, the technology is actually working. So, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you are in the world. As Stuart has well said, my name's Tony Gower-Jones, and I would really like to talk to you about what we have learned, but also what we haven't. People talk about learning from incidents, and believe me, over my career, I have seen a massive change of what we have learned from incidents. There's a picture quiz for you. When I first started my career in 1976 at a chemical works in Carrington, working for Shell, um, we were sitting in a world, and my early days were in a world where things happened. Shit happened. And by that, I mean big stuff. Flixborough, 30 dead, and that was on a Sunday. It had been 300. Cerveso, 3 Mile Island, the Alexander Keelan, Bhopal, Challenger, Chernobyl, the Herald of Free Enterprise, Piper Alpha, Exxon Valdez. About every 18 months, the world was shook by a major incident that had global impact and effect. They're not happening every 18 months. And when they do happen, they're actually not involving thousands or hundreds of fatalities, but perhaps 10 or 20. So we have learned. We have massively changed. And I'd like to just go through some of the things that we've learned. The first stage in the 1980s was very much an engineering approach. Legislators went from rule-based to risk-based legislation, and industry responded in an engineering approach. We developed HAZOP. I had a plant change in Carrington in my early days, which I didn't like, and I was refusing to sign it. And a senior chemical engineer said, "Should we HAZOP it?" And we all went, "What's one of them?" Because he had literally the day or the week before been with ICI and been taught HAZOP, and we didn't know what it was. That plant change never happened. Saved my career. The Swiss cheese model came out. Bow ties appeared. We had safety cases. We started building things like safety management systems. And we started with the tripod causation path. And you've seen that on a number of presentations of that. And the tripod causation path was quite intriguing because it basically is a good people model. People, controls are not in place because good people don't put them in place. And they're good people trying to do the right thing, but the environment around them means they don't. And what that model did is it started people questioning about the environment. And then we saw the next wave in the 90s coming through, which is all about how do we understand the environment we're putting good people in and why they're making mistakes. And we saw things like culture models coming out. Keele Institute actually developed the culture model on behalf of the HSE. You saw one coming out with Shell in the Hearts and Minds. You saw the DuPont culture model. We had lots and lots of behavior models, perhaps the most famous being Jim Reason's GEMS model, the generic one. And we went through, we started trying to understand how we created those culture. It got complex. The more we learned, the more complicated and difficult it seemed to become, because we had lots of bow ties and we had lots of culture stuff and we had lots of human behavior models. And there was a plea around the 2000s by leadership going, what the hell do I need to do? How can I simplify this? It's getting too complex. And industry reacted in two ways. The life-saving rules, basically built on what are those critical barriers we need to maintain to stop people dying. And then very quickly, that was followed by the process safety community going, yeah, what's the same for us in terms of process safety fundamentals? And that took us through to around 2010. And the next big wave that came through was how do we learn from incidents? And the Learning from Incidents Guide 2016 and the one we're talking about today, you see things like investigation insights being produced, which is what's the sign, what does a leader need to know? What does an investigator need to know? How do I need to get that information transferred into industry or to change it? Tripod Light, which is all about learning from near misses, where you haven't got 3 or 4 people spending days or weeks on an incident investigation. You've got a supervisor spending 2 hours. How can I get information from that? So, first of all, I'd like you all to just look at each other and congratulate yourselves on the amount that we have learned, that we have changed, and we are so much better. We are absolutely. David came back to it. Was it 30 odd fatalities in 20 years and one? And we have done the same in terms of the way we operate our businesses. We've made that fundamental change by what we have learned. And we should be proud of it. We should sing it from the rooftops. And all of that knowledge is still valuable. There are people out there who try to say, oh, you can't use this, you can't use this. There is value in all of it. Let's not throw babies out with bathwaters. So, where do we go from there? Where do we go from 2030 to 2050? And that's the challenge. And it's a challenge because if anyone believes I've got the answers, I don't. It's a challenge I would like to put out there to the 156 people on this call. So, you've seen the causation model sitting there. Incidents occur because barriers fail, and barriers are failed because of immediate causes, people doing the wrong thing or not doing the right thing. They're influenced by their conditions, the performance influencing factors, and underlying causation creates that. When the tripod model first came out in the late 80s and early 90s, there was actually another box to the left of that called fallible management decisions. Because the way we operate our business and the decisions we make as leaders and managers create those underlying causes. It didn't last long when we were doing fatal accident investigations because sticking the MD's decision up and saying that caused the death was a little bit career limiting for the few of us that were trying to do it at that stage. Wasn't great in creating your career. But I want to come back to this and I want you to actually trust me with one thing. This will be very difficult for most of you on the line and listening to understand. But we all now believe that people are good people and the environment they're in creates those poor decisions they make at immediate causes. Now, I want you to actually believe that CEOs, senior directors, operational leaders, I will exclude CFOs from this, but those people are actually human and are trying to do the right thing, and they're influenced by the environment around them. So think about that. Those fallible management decisions are created because of the environment that these people are placed in, our senior leaders are placed in. So let's have a look. How can we create an environment where leaders instinctively do the right thing? What I'd like to do is just look at a little bit of history. A gentleman called Peter Decker, 1955. What gets measured gets managed. We all know that. What's a little bit less familiar was a critique of Decker's paper in 1956 by a gentleman called Ridgway. And Ridgway said, what gets measured gets managed, even when it's pointless to measure it and manage it, and even if it harms the organisation to do so. Now, that's still true today. About 6 months ago, the UK government produced a new list of hospitals and they produced a league table and they ranked all the hospitals in the UK in a league table. And the CEO of the Nuffield Trust, which is a great institute of health in the UK, came out with a critique of it. There is a risk that trusts will only focus on the measures that immediately boost their ranking, even if it's not necessarily the best for patients. And if we look back at what's happened in the health service in the UK, we can see that focusing on certain key performance indicators, you actually don't focus on what is important. Not everything, that you can measure is important, and not everything that is important can be measured. Came back from Ridgway. So that got me thinking a couple of years ago about what are leaders in organizations actually measuring? Because change comes from leaders looking at data, having discussions, and creating action plans from that data, from that information. And you heard David say much earlier in this presentation that they changed the conversations they were having by the information they had. Well, I was working for an organization and I was wondering what the conversations looked like. So I got a summer student to go into a set of business units at senior level. These guys were having conversations about health, safety, and environment, and I wanted to know what they were talking about. Were they talking about the event, right at the right side? Were they talking about the barrier failure? Were they talking about people's behavior, good people doing the wrong things or not doing the things they were supposed to do? Were they talking about underlying causations, or were they talking about the performance indicating platforms? And you can see the vast majority of discussions were actually about the events. In David's words, they were about 2D rather than 3D. That's how the discussions were. This student was probably the brightest person in the room, because she then moved on, got a first-class honours from Oxford, and I regret never being able to attract her into that company. Because what she did was, we had wonderful balanced scorecards, dashboards. Excel was wonderful, and I'm sure you've all got them out there. You all know about these scorecards. And she mapped what was on that scorecard to the tripod causation model. And the vast majority of data that we were producing to create these conversations was about events. And actually, given that, I'm quite surprised that these leaders actually managed to, some of them, talk about underlying causes, because there's no way about the data that we were producing that was pointing them in that direction. So if you want to do one thing, leaving this webinar, I suggest you sit in leadership meetings and just do that mapping for yourself and say, what are our leaders talking about? And then look at the performance indicators you're producing and say, how are we driving those conversations? So, where's the real challenge? Well, the real challenge, if you think about the environment that our C-suite is in, is less internal. All of you out there listening to this webinar can actually do that mapping that I've just spoken about, start changing the internal data, and go out and start changing conversations that will create less underlying causes. So you can do that now. What we don't know how to do is how to measure safety going forward. What information do we have to give to investors so that they don't put pressure on the C-suite? What do we have to give to those people who are doing the analysis of a company, of giving a buy or no buy to shareholders out there? How do they look at safety? Shareholders, journalists, because that's a huge group of people that are affecting the C-suite, the top level of every company out there. And that is somewhere where we need to engage our senior leaders and start doing new research. I don't have the answers, but we do know there is a lot of ways that we can change what we're measuring by the tools and techniques we know about. And David's shown you how Cadent have just done that, and start this conversation that gains interest and perhaps some research into how we should be measuring safety going forward over the next 20 years. On that, I'm going to pass you back to Stuart.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tony. Excellent. So, any questions for Tony, please put in the chat. So we're going to have a Q&A session now. We do have a hard stop at 2:30. Before, if the questions obviously fizzle out, and I believe David does have to leave as well. So, with that, I think what I'm going to do is firstly just do a quick plug, actually, because Tony, your challenge to everybody about going and measuring the conversations that you are having. We're actually developing a short video to help facilitate that conversation, and I expect that video will be published. Well, we haven't got the final version, but I expect it will be published not too long. Maybe if we're talking weeks rather than months. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through and I'm going to ask the questions roughly in order that have come in. The first question is for David. So please explain T-Point TV.
So it's it's a broadcast channel. So as I said, we have 6,000 folk, of which 4,000 are field-based engineers, roughly. It is a streaming channel that we use to engage with, communicate with that community on all manner of things: safety, performance, communities, all manner of things that are going on in the organisation, system changes, data changes, things that they need to be aware of. And it sort of sits and runs in the background. It's our internal, our internal broadcast.
Okay, excellent. And the next question is related. Can the post to the podcast link be shared? Is that or is that just the internal?
It's internal, but I bet there is something we can do. But what I would say, I'd encourage folk to do their own. It costs us nothing. It doesn't cost anything. And what we look to do is to have the contemporary voices in the room. So the people that were in the event talk about the event. They talk about how it felt, what it smelt like, what it sounded like. Yes, you bring the situation to life, and you kind of you spend your days trying to make sure that people don't get exposed to these things. But you do need to expose the organisation to the realities of the hazards we face, and you bring the contemporary voices in, and it's your situation, it's your scenario, and it's in your language. So I'm sure we can do something to share, but I think getting this stuff out there helps people understand.
How long is each podcast?
There is, in fact, when we started, they were probably a bit long. We try and clip them now to about 10-15 minutes.
10-15 minutes, okay. Okay. Did you get good engagement with those?
Good listen. Yeah, people hooking into it. Yeah, so there's a bit of branding, dig into safety. It's kind of the podcast channel. So yeah, we a bit of branding around it, and then we look to do get it so it's contemporary within a month or two of the thing, whatever the thing is. We look to try and make it relevant, and an authentic contemporary voices is the trick.
Okay, excellent. So this, I'm not sure who this question is for. It says, which investigation method do you use and how to decide? So I think this is one probably for Richard, because we know what you're using, David. And Richard, in your slides, you had about 24, I think, that were listed. So how do you decide? And if anyone wants to jump in as well to answer, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience anyway, and there's a lot more on this within the guide, because I'm a human factors specialist, so I talk about different methods for analysing the human factors side, whereas some of my colleagues who have worked in the accident investigation branch, etc., had written about more comprehensive tools, which aren't just to do with human factors. I mean, I don't think there is one answer to that question, to be honest. I think, which one do you choose and how do you decide? Well, it does depend upon the event that you're trying to investigate and what will be an appropriate methodology for looking at that event. Typically, there will be something required in terms of human factors, because there will be something which has gone wrong, which has been caused by something else. One thing we don't want to do is we don't want to end up with the conclusion being that, well, human factors was the cause, or human error was the cause, or non-compliance with the rules was the cause, because that ain't going to get us anywhere. So we need to definitely delve deeper than that. But in terms of which specific technique you would use to get those answers, that is really horses for courses. It does depend on the investigation and the incident.
I think one of the things that the guidance does do is it tries to steer towards this idea that, there's a level of complexity, I suppose, to the incident. Obviously, the competence of the investigator and the methodology that is chosen is sort of needs to be tailored to that. And if I remember correctly, the guidance does suggest that perhaps organisations have 2 or 3 different methodologies that they train in, and then obviously they use the appropriate one based on the personnel and the complexity of the event. Tony, you're nodding along. I don't know if you've got
Yeah, and I've got some really strong views on this. And I think, first of all, it becomes that concept of triage that Richard spoke about. Yeah, read the guidance on triage, because triage is where you make your decision of how much effort you're going to put in. Organizations tend to, and I've been guilty of this as well, tend to over investigate. And they tend to try and do too many investigations badly rather than a few deep ones in a lot of deaths with continent people. So don't be afraid to say we're not going to go any further with this investigation. So certainly read the guide on triaging. Recognize that you've basically got almost 2 to 3 levels that you do with. One is you just record it. Secondly, you just basically want to see, can you find one control failure, one immediate cause, one underlying cause, and you've only got perhaps a partially trained supervisor and about 2 hours of work to get something out of that, and then be able to add lots of those near misses together to actually create change. Yeah, because having a supervision into 20 investigations, have nothing out of it. If you do 300 and you've got one good point coming out of 300, add those together and then say, where's our problem area? And there's guidance in that. And that's really where we aim something like tripod light at. And then when you've got something that is either very high potential, actual, or you think there's a lot of learning, that's when you actually do them properly. Because if you're going to go into some form of detailed depth and spend 2, 3, 4, 5,000 man hours on this, yeah, better make sure you do it properly. And historically, organizations have been very superficial. They spend a week, 2 weeks, team of 3 or 4 together and come up, and they don't really come up with any underlying causes, and it becomes a sort of set of papering over crack recommendations. Don't be afraid to stand up and say, if we're not going to put the time and effort in, we're not going any further. We're just going to go and do a supervision investigation, or we're just going to be recording it. Yeah. Because otherwise you're going to waste time, effort, and money, and you're not being effective. I see Richard nodding manly. So I'm probably repeating what's in the guidance.
I couldn't agree more, Tony. I mean, I think that is absolutely crucial to this. I'd rather see something done really, really well and have a big impact than have a dozen things done really poorly and not really advance anything. So I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
David, was there anything you wanted to add? I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I think the next.
No, I was just listening to Tony then, and in fact, the thing that we'll be talking about with our board next week is just that we've done we did a quick investigation and wrung some value out and stopped there. We didn't invoke all the tools and might we could have done. Take it far enough, and that's right.
And the other thing I would actually say, that just think about, people talk about investigation and incident, and that's actually change your mindset. What you're doing is investigating a control failure, and it may be just one control failure in a multiple modes of control failure, but you may say, that's the one I'm really interested in. I'm not interested in all the other control failures that I can see, because I'm going to get learning out of that control failure. And that's a mental mindset to change. Incident investigation or control failure investigation, barrier failure investigation. It's a big mindset change, and it is actually different when you think about it.
Okay, excellent. Right, thank you, Tony. The next question is sort of for Richard, probably me as well. So some of the processes of learning, such as reflection, are they missing from the guidance? And I think that's really just because they weren't in your slides, Richard, but that's probably because we've got 200 pages in the guide. We've got 20 slides.
Yes. No, in the guidance, have a look into the guidance, because that does go into a lot of depth about different levels of reflection, different levels of learning, and all of the stuff that you just mentioned there. There's the entire section on the evaluation piece and learning and broader learning. that's kind of 3 chapters. There's tons of stuff in there. So
Yeah.
we're going to have a look into that.
It's really important, actually. The investigation insights, which is another set of guidance out there, has a bit about reflective learning. Yeah, and that is a huge area where I don't think people have paid enough attention to in the past. Yeah, reflective learning. How do I get this information across to it? Yeah, and how do I know about it? Because whenever you have a future incident, somebody knows about it.
I would say you're right, Tony. So reflective learning is really covered in probably, I'd say, 2 main ways in the guidance. So we have towards the end of the guidance, which is sort of reflective learning in sort of teams, and that's all around sort of sharing and broader learning outside of the immediate people who are sort of involved in the incident. And then the other part is, Tony says, it's earlier in the guide. It's actually before you've even done the investigation report. So it's probably chapter 6 or 7 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's really reflective learning across, well, not the investigation team as such, but the investigation team and their immediate stakeholders, leaders in particular. And that really is all around leading to the recommendations and the actions. So rather than the investigator coming up with the actions themselves, it's actually the broad, those involved and the leaders, and getting that buy-in from the leaders to create change. So reflection is absolutely covered in the guide in those 2 main, at least those 2 main ways.
Yeah.
I can give you an example of the frustration of it. Call at 10 o'clock one night back in the late 80s, where we had a blowout on a oil well, but we'd only drilled 90 meters and we were in the water reservoir, and it was the water part that was blowing out. Slight problem is it was saturated with H2S, which didn't make it very nice. I was doing the night shift, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, one of my petroleum engineer I knew walked past me and said, "What are you doing here?" So I told him. He turned around and said, "Was the well anywhere near?" And gave another well. I said, "Yeah, it's the next well. It's about 50 meters away." He said, "Yeah, there's a dip in the ground there, and that they had the same problem 15 years ago when they drilled it." So we had repeated the same incident with water because it just was lower and the water reservoir would flow. Yeah. Had we reflectively learnt that? Had we traced that? No, we hadn't.
Okay. Just moving on to the next question. So Richard, we engaged a broad range of investigators, but did we include the Institute of Industrial Accident Investigators as part of that process? I don't recall them. Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, well, a couple of people who were members of that organisation, yes. So I think there was 2 people who were associated with that organisation that joined us.
Okay, and we did, of course, include essentially the head of investigations at Shell and BP as well, and several other of our members of Chevron, I think,
Yes,
as well as a number of independent investigators as well who do this for full time were heavily consulted as well.
Yeah, and people from government as well. So where we had somebody from the Ministry of Defence involved, we have Civil Aviation Authority, we had Marine Accident Investigation Branch, Air Accident Investigation Branch, National Air Traffic Services. We had a really broad range of people who just do investigations as well. So, but yes, we did have membership of MIIAI.
Excellent. And does the guideline include a list of immediate causes and root causes? As most investigations end with just human factors rather than reaching any sort of root causes.
Well, I think, as I was saying before, you wouldn't really expect a comprehensive list of causes that you could pick from. That's where the analysis technique would come in to try to get down to those. But I think it goes back to one of the things that I mentioned before. I think one of my big bugbears, so having worked in the aviation industry for a number of years, one of the things that absolutely used to drive me mad was when you used to see a press report that said there's been an air crash and the cause is pilot error. And, immediately air traffic accidents as well. And you would think, Well, that's absolute rubbish to begin with, because the cause will not be pilot error. The cause will be something completely different, but we will likely have set that pilot up to fail somehow, and we need to find out what that is. So human error, human failure, even down to things like terms like non-compliance or violation, that is not where you want to stop. You want to get down to, well, what's the actual cause of that cause? So we're talking about human factors causes in particular, and we're saying, well, something made it possible for the person to make that error or to violate that procedure. Let's understand what that is, and then we're actually fixing something tangible, rather than simply saying, well, the human failed or the human made an error. Right? Why? So in answer to the question, I would say you wouldn't necessarily expect a list of immediate and root causes as part of any guidance. You would expect that the tools that you use would get you to those. But my kind of add-on to it is, let's just blink and make sure we're going beyond it was human error. Let's get beneath that.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about KPIs? So you mentioned KPIs in your presentation. So how do you set KPIs that measure, what you're interested in finding out on managing, but doesn't drive undesirable behaviours? And perhaps this isn't just a question for you, perhaps it's a question for Tony and David as well. Or does the undesirable behaviours, is that more an indication of the organisational culture rather than the KPI itself?
A little bit of that, I think. But I think, in terms of the KPIs, we talked quite a bit about the typical division between KPIs, i.e. leading and lagging. But we also talked about things which would be, particularly when it came to evaluation of investigations, don't just stick to the obvious stuff. Well, how many investigations have we done? How many incidents did we have? Did we investigate them all when it was appropriate to do so, and all that kind of stuff? Be looking more at the kind of quality of all of that as well. Be looking at the quality of the analysis that's been performed. Be looking at the closure of the actions, for example. Be looking at whether those actions have had any sort of longevity. So did we implement an action and then 6 months later, that action which has been put in place has actually just been discontinued? It's kind of fallen off people's radar and things like that. So there are things specific to KPIs, and we do break that section of the guidance down into about 2 or 3 different subsections about things to measure, and things that I think Tony's mentioned already today about measuring things which are actually useful for the purpose in which you're trying to achieve. But I would say I've just been speaking over the last couple of days about safety culture within organisations, and I think there are some aspects of this which come down to the culture within the organisation, in terms of whether they're willing to actually accept these kind of measures, and whether they're actually willing to do anything about them. And I think there is a link there to culture. Depending on the organisation, that can be quite a clear link and a very obvious link, or it can be more of a kind of tenuous, fluffy link that you have to go and investigate a little bit more. But I think there's a very broad range of KPIs mentioned in the guidance, but I think there is a link back to the culture as well, as to what extent is the organisation willing to use them. Because it's all very well having KPIs, but if they're not used, they're useless.
Yeah. Can I just say the difference between KPIs and PIs? I think it's really quite important that you understand there is a difference. A lot of performance indicators around incident investigations are useful, but setting targets for those performance indicators is not. Because very often you will then manage, going back to Ridgway, the indicator rather than actually use the performance indicator to give you guidance on conversations. Yeah? So be very, very, very careful in this space about target setting with KPIs versus information given with KPIs. It's really it's a minefield. And the problem you get that you create an environment where your leaders start to manage the number as opposed to actually managing the business. I know, David, you gave some really interesting stuff on the stuff that you managed different things, and you saw your injury rates drop. And that's really important because you were managing and doing focusing on the right things, and the injuries just dropped. And I've had that before where I've walked into an organization that had a key performance indicator with bonuses on injury rates, got rid of it, put the bonuses on doing safety tours, reviewing incidents and stuff like that. And guess what? Yeah, they never made the injury rate bonus while it was there. When they focused on doing the right things, the injury rates went well below the old bonus points, but it wasn't important. It's not the number. So, David, would you like to add your experience? Because I think you've had some really good experience in this
a bit of
recently.
that. The bit was going through my head, Tony, and we're literally going through this process with our board at the minute. What do we measure? So, what are we trying to achieve as an organisation? Some of that's safety, some of that's environmental, some of it's fine. There's a whole range of things that you have to do. What are we going to look at? Inputs and outputs. Typically, we lean on the inputs, but how do you keep track of the outputs? And it actually plays to what Tony said. Think through what you're trying to achieve and think through what you're measuring from a range of points of view. So, a customer in our world, a regulator, an investor, an employee, each have a perspective on the thing you're trying to achieve. And how do you pick the right thing and measure it in the right way that is helpful to a range of people? Because it's big organizations, companies, businesses are not simple organisms. They are complicated things with a range of viewpoints. And having a rounded view gets you to a much better place. It's not easy. And I think Tony, it's not so much a science as an art.
I think you're absolutely right there, and there is David and I have had some conversations around this area, and they've been really brilliant conversations. It's about looking at what you're measuring, and it's about listening to the conversations it creates. So it comes back to that concept of, try things, see what the conversation it creates is, and then modify. And this is part of this whole how do we measure safety question that is my challenge out there. There isn't a simple answer, but there are plenty of things that you can try, but just listen to the conversations because in your gut, and this is the art. You're absolutely right, David. You can listen to a senior management or a meeting conversation and you can walk away and say, Jesus, that was good. They were really deep. They were getting into the right areas. And that the performance indicators, the measurements, what was out there to create that conversation was the right thing. And equally, you bloody obvious when it's the other way around.
Excellent. Now there are many, many more questions here. Sadly, we don't have time to answer them because two of our speakers need to leave. So we are going to draw this webinar to a close in a minute. I just want to say apologies if we didn't get round to your question. Some of these are very, very good questions. The one that really stood out to me was how to deal with a situation where all your KPIs are green, but the ground reality is different. We have a video on that we're producing as well. So great question, and the video won't necessarily answer it, but it will perhaps help you to start thinking about how you can answer it yourself. That should be developed over the next maybe 2 months, let's say. With that, I think I will thank our speakers. So thank you, David. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Tony. Absolute pleasure to have you here. And thank you to everybody for tuning in to the webinar. We've still got 134 people on the line, even after 1.5 hours. So that just shows how important the topic is. And thank you very much. Have a great day and a great weekend. And we'll see you on the next webinar.
Before you close, we're about to produce a podcast to answer that one, aren't we? We're in the process of producing a podcast to answer that question. Yeah, so watch this space.
Brilliant.
Right.